to trial with respect to the one thing that he pled guilty to, namely transferring one set of classified information, not to an enemy, but to a friendly allied, say Israel, he would never have gotten anywhere near life imprisonment. And I say that because the average imprisonment for people who've committed the same offense for which he is now in his 29th year in prison is 2 to 4 years. Yet he is now in his 29th year in prison. And so the United States violated its plea bargain agreement. And more than that, they submitted at the time when they were supposed to submit the plea bargain agreement to the judge for sentencing, they submitted a false affidavit by the then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, in which he accused Pollard of treason, something for which he was not accused, in order to have him imprisoned on the basis of the fact as if he was accused for that. And so for years thereafter, you always would read stories that Pollard has been in prison because of his treasonable acts. And then it extended to the fact that he was responsible for the murder of US agents in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, etc., to continue to build on this false initial affidavit of treason, until it finally became proven, though this is not all that well known, that the very person who was responsible for American agents being murdered in the former Soviet Union was the head of the US CIA for Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, a man by the name of Aldrich Ames. But he was not only responsible for the people that Pollard was accused of having had murdered, but he was the person who was the lead evidence against Pollard at the time, with respect to Pollard having been responsible for that murder. I can go on, but what you can see here is that Pollard was falsely imprisoned for the time in which he has been spending in prison, and that the time that he has spent is excessive, disproportionate, unjust, and unfair. And while I would not go so far as to say that Pollard is a political prisoner, I will go so far as to say that he is, as we meet, and has been for some time, wrongly imprisoned. And we have a responsibility to call upon the President of the United States, because that's the only person who can now grant relief, because he has the exclusive authority with regard to clemency at this point, that he must release Pollard, not as a gesture for the release of other murderers and the like, but as a constitutional duty that the President of the United States owes in terms of fidelity to the American Constitution. And so the case has to be made on the basis of the rule of law, as it was made for Sharansky, as it was made for Mandela, as it should be made for Pollard. Thank you.
I want to thank Professor Cotler very, very much. Well, it was a wonderful talk. Professor Cotler very kindly agreed to take questions from the audience. So we'll take a few questions. So I'll come with the microphone to you so everyone can hear your question. You can address Professor Cotler. Please say your name and then your question.
My name is Gilad Graz. My question to you is based on your experience in South Africa and in the anti-apartheid movement. My question is I have two questions. How serious do you take the BDS movement? And the second question is, do you think that the navigators of the pro-Palestinian campaign against Israel, that also includes many liberal Jews in the United States and in Canada, are using the model that the anti-apartheid movement used and are forcing that narrative today? And it also connects with Arafat's speech in South Africa, by the way, his infamous Salami speech, where Arafat gave a number of years where he said he'd get Israel back, whether he based that also on the South African experience.
Well, you know, I was in South Africa in 2001 for the Durban Conference at the time, the infamous Durban Conference, where a conference that was intended to be a world conference against racism was turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jewish people, where a conference that was to be the first international conference on human rights in the 21st century turned into a conference to criminalize Israel for its violations of human rights, alleged violations of human rights. And that's where the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement was born. Now, being there at the time, the real danger was not, as some felt, that came from governments at the time, though there was some. It came from the NGO movement. It was the NGO movement that developed all the formulas with regard to boycott, divestment, sanctions that then were picked up by the international movements of solidarity against Israel and in the name of Palestinian rights. And what I was trying to suggest is that in effect is really a betrayal of Mandela's legacy, because he never consorted with the notion that Israel did not have a right to exist, or that the BDS should be applied to Israel, and he recognized Zionism as a legitimate national liberation movement, which is why I say we should seek to appropriate Mandela legacy on behalf of our case and cause, and rather than be defensive as if we have to apologize because Arafat was a friend of Mandela and therefore we're on the wrong side. I think we can invoke Mandela and do so in a way that he did, and be both on the right side of history and on the right side of the case and cause and the struggle against racism. And you know, one other thing, if I may take a page out of Mandela's book, when he came to Canada, he really made an important statement about the indigenous peoples in Canada, what we call our Aboriginal peoples. And it was a case and cause that Mandela felt closely identified with, even in South Africa. You know, when he came, you know, to the Rivonia trial and the like, he came in native dress, so in terms of being identified with, you know, that part of his own indigenous heritage. Now, I think that we need to make the case in terms of the Jewish people as being an indigenous people. In other words, the Jewish people, perhaps the only people that still, if you think about it, that still inhabit the same land, embrace the same religion, study the same Aboriginal or indigenous Torah, hearken to the same Aboriginal prophets, speak the same Aboriginal language, Hebrew, and bear the same Aboriginal name, Israel, as we did 3,500 years ago. And so we are a prototypical Aboriginal people. And we should therefore invoke, if you will, yet another component of Mandela's legacy, of his concern the indigenous peoples, and say, hey, you know, we are the indigenous people here. We're not the colonizing people. We are the indigenous people. I'm not making a case here for settlements or Eretz Yisrael. I'm making a case for the fundamental legitimation and relationship of the Jewish people to the land of Israel and to the heritage of its people. So I'm saying that we can take that page and use that to advance. I'm sorry, you had a first thing about South Africa that I may have missed in your initial few words of question.
Whether you think that the navigators of the pro-Palestinian anti-Israel campaign today are using the same model that you were involved with yourself with the anti-apartheid movement, whether they're forcing that narrative, and whether you think the BDS movement is a...
Well, I think they're using the same model, but I think we can turn it against them. And I always say that one of the problems that we have in terms of Israel's situation in the larger picture, not only boycott, divestment, but in what I call the delegitimization movement with regard to Israel. What makes that delegitimization movement, so seemingly effective, it's not that delegitimization is a new phenomenon. It was always with us. When Israel was first created, Israel's creation was spoken of as an original sin. So delegitimization was always there. What is dramatically different, and it's been different for some time, is being what I call the laundering or masking of that delegitimization under all the human values, so that Israel then appears to be against all the human values on the wrong side of history. And so what is happening is that the delegitimization is laundered under the protective cover of the United Nations. And so one uses the annual 20 to 22 resolutions against Israel to say, you see, the United States representative of the international, etc., etc., or laundered under international law. In other words, misrepresenting international law, but turning Israel, as it were, into an international pariah, or laundering it under the culture of human rights. And so Israel is pointed out as if it was a kind of a geopolitical antichrist of our time, or laundering it under the struggle against racism, where the case studies are Israel is an apartheid state, and if that is not bad enough, because you have to understand, under international law, apartheid is a crime against humanity. So if you say Israel is an apartheid state, you're saying Israel is a crime against humanity. If it's a crime against humanity, it has no right to be. And therefore boycotts, divestment, sanctions are the minimum of what you can do against this crime against humanity. And if that's not enough, you say that Israel is a Nazi state, a real perversion of the Holocaust remembrance and the like. So an apartheid Nazi state not only has no right to be, but we have an obligation to do whatever we can to make sure that it has no right to be, etc., in the name of human rights, international law, struggle against racism. So we have to turn all that around and take one paradigm, and with this I close. The conventional paradigm with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and the like is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the core of all conflict in the Middle East. The occupation is the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and apartheid Israel is the core of the occupation. I think it's our responsibility to turn that paradigm around and say that it in fact is radical Islam that is the core of not only the Arab-Israeli, but all conflict in the Middle East. What is happening in Syria, what is happening in Egypt, what is happening none of these things have anything to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So whenever you hear the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the core of all conflict in the Middle East, it's simply a false slander. So the first thing is to put the responsibility where it exists. Secondly, that the real apartheid continues to be the inability, the unwillingness of most of the Arab states and much of the Palestinian leadership to accept the legitimacy as distinct from just existence of a Jewish state as distinct from a state called Israel in the Middle East. That is the real Middle East apartheid. And it doesn't end there, because what you have in terms of Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and the like is not only an apartheid in the unwillingness to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state in the Middle East, but to publicly call for the destruction of that Jewish state. So that's a criminal apartheid in the most comprehensive sense of the word. So I think we should take the same things and turn it around. But for that, we have to get out of the docket, stop acting always as the accused, become the plaintiff claimant, and put the others in the docket of the accused. That is the way I think we need to approach it.
Thank you for the elegant lecture. Congratulations on your achievements, Professor. My name is Mark Rothenberg. I was really struck by...
You even have a counterpart on the name back in Montreal, so it's okay. Part of what I call the Jewish connection. Yeah.
I was struck by the conversation you had with the minister, because he used Sharansky, as you indicated, to justify the position of the apartheid government, and that was, obviously opposite of the way you were thinking. And I'm now perplexed by that, but I also want to draw perhaps a parallel. It seems perplexing to me that the international community that is, is standing back and not doing all the natural things against Iran today. And like you said, I mean, they're ignoring 3 of the 4 threats, based on the recent negotiations with regard to the nuclear proliferation. So my question really now is why? Why was that minister using Sharansky, and why today is the international community silent about really this problem that seems very clear?
Now, what's interesting, he was using Sharansky because he saw in Sharansky a kind of metaphor for the struggle against the communist Soviet Union. And South Africa was fighting against the communist Soviet Union, and they took Sharansky as a leitmotif, and Sharansky at that time was, a celebrity figure, so it was almost as if South Africa was trying to buy in on the coattails of Sharansky to fight the communist Soviet Union. That's the first thing. The second thing, and the important thing, is that ultimately Botha turned against his own apartheid regime, and then, just as initially he had Sharansky as a symbol for the reasons I mentioned, and Mandela as a target for the reasons that I mentioned, he then embraced Mandela along with Sharansky. So it means you can turn people around, and sometimes you can turn them around by using their own leitmotifs. Now, if you take the question of Iran today and why is it happening, I think one of the problems is we don't have any world leaders, of a kind of Churchillian nature, if you will, who will stand up to Iran as needs to be done. I will say, and I don't want to be at the risk of self-serving, I think the Canadian government has been very good. And I say this as a member of the opposition, but I have to say that on these issues, the Canadian government has stood steadfast with regard to Iran and has pointedly identified the Iranian fourfold threat, and we have, discontinued. We have no diplomatic relations with Iran. We closed the Iranian embassy in Ottawa, and we closed our Canadian embassy in Iran. And when there was some objection to the fact that we did that, I think the foreign minister said, look, our foreign policy is a principled foreign policy. We're not going to go along to get along. We're going to go ahead and take the important leadership positions that have to be taken. And I think in terms of the United States, unfortunately, there's been too much leading from behind. And if you take the case of Syria, one of the interesting things about Syria, of all the movements of the Arab Spring, as it was called at the time, the most peaceful protest actually was in Syria. The real civilian beginnings of protest was in Syria. And I had been to Damascus, a number of occasions. I had met with the people there. I thought that it was a promising beginning. What happened then is that you had this in March 2011. We're coming up to 3 years now in terms of the initial Syrian civilian protest. By the end of April 2011, The Economist had a front page leader article which said, savagery in Syria. At that point, only if I can use that term, some 400 had been killed in Syria. Close to a year later, only, again in quotations, some 8,000 had been killed in Syria. I say that because now we're close to 140,000. Those of us at the time who were calling for support for this civilian protest movement were told, and when we say support, just in terms of humanitarian assistance, moral and political support, defensive weaponry and the like, we're told, if we intervene in Syria, that will lead to more sectarian strife, that will lead to a civil war, that will lead to jihadists. Everything that people said would happen if we intervened, happened because we didn't intervene. And so once again, indifference and inaction took us down the road to the worst kind, and now there are no good options, to be very frank. Now there are jihadists in Syria, now that this is not a civilian protest movement any longer. And now, frankly, we've reached a point where, because we did not exercise the leadership we should have at the time, the Syrian people are paying the price. And in the last month alone, you've had over 600, Syrians have been killed, over 200 of them children. And so you have a situation, August 21st was the day of the last chemical weapons attack where some 1,400 were killed. But Obama had said a year earlier, I don't think the Syrians was accidental, exactly on the day of August 21st, 2013, when you had a chemical weapons attack in which 1,400 were killed. A year earlier, on August 21st, Obama said that the use of chemical weapons would be a red line. Now, there must have been about 15, at least, examples of the use of chemical weapons from August 21st, 2012 to August 21st, 2013. It turned out that the red line was a pink advisory. In other words, nothing was done. Finally, you get the August 21st, 1,400 killed, and so an arrangement takes place for an agreement for the dismantling of the chemical weapons in Syria. But this gave a green light to the continuing killing by all other means. And just last week, the Iranian leadership tweeted about the fact, as I said, nobody else in the population could tweet, tweeted about the fact that they used barrel bombs against terrorists. The barrel bombs against the terrorists in Aleppo were 120 people that were killed that day, 50 of them children, all of whom were civilians. And so I think that the horrific nature of what's happening in Syria today owes to the absence of effective leadership. The same people who were ineffective with regard to Syria were the same people who remain ineffective with regard to Iran. And I hope that I'm wrong, but this agreement that has taken place, the centrifuges are still spinning, the uranium is still being enriched, the political prisoners are still being arrested, the execution is still going on, and I've yet to see the leadership that is required for that which is so singularly compelling.
We'll take our last question.
Professor Cotler, how do you see the prospects of peace between Israel and the Palestinians?
When I
From Smokey Simon.
I didn't mention, but the other thing that I've been involved in from the mid-70s has been the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian peace process. I spent every summer, 1975, 76, 77, 78, 3 to 4 months every summer in the Arab countries. Even the word Arab is too homogenous. In Egypt, in Syria, in Jordan, in the territories, and then in Israel. My friends were asking me, what am I doing this for? Why am I going there? It's not that I thought this was such a good place to vacation. I went there because I felt I wanted to have a better understanding, not just of the foreign policy, the Arab foreign policy of Egypt, Syria, etc., but also a better understanding of the culture and psychology of the leadership and the people. And I'll close just with one example, and then maybe it might lead to the answering your question a little bit in context. In 75 and 76, I spent a month in each of those years in the Institute of Political and Strategic Studies in Al-Ahram. The head of it was Boutros Ghali. In 1977, I was in Egypt when Menachem Begin was elected prime minister here in Israel. And Boutros Ghali was now the foreign minister of Egypt. But of course we knew each other from the 2 previous years in which I had worked in the Institute of Political and Strategic Studies in Cairo, Al-Ahram. And he knew of my involvement with Israel. I never hid it. I was clear about my identification. So he asked me if I would come and meet with President Sadat. And, it was a long conversation. I'll extrapolate. There were two questions that Sadat asked. One, can I make peace with the Likud government? And my answer was yes, because the Likud government can carry Israel. Second was, can I make peace with Menachem Begin? And my answer was, well, I don't know Menachem Begin, but he is known to me to be a principled person, a real Democrat, and somebody who I believe would like to make peace, if that can happen, with the largest Arab country, with Egypt. So at that time I was given a note by Sadat to bring to Begin, and I sort of cut short the rest of my trip that summer. Actually, it was a very fateful trip because it led to how I both met and married my wife. She, at the time, was the parliamentary secretary of Likud, really the highest ranking woman in Likud at the time. The only thing I regret with regard to my marriage is that Likud lost such a wonderful, political organizer and the like. I can almost trace some of the deterioration politically in Likud to the time when she left. So I arrive in Israel, and as I enter Israel, I meet an old friend of mine, Uri Gordon, who was then working with the Labour Party, and he invited me to a luncheon with young Knesset members. And at the luncheon was my wife-to-be. And he, at one point, says as follows, Irwin Cotler is here from North America. I'd like to ask him to say a few words about North American Jews. And I spoke in Hebrew, and I said, look, you hear enough about North American Jews. I've just come from Damascus. Let me say something about Syrian Jews. And I did, and my then wife-to-be, I didn't yet know, writes a note to a friend of hers that I must be some kind of spy. Because when you think about it, at that time there were no relations with any of the Arab countries, and here I'm wandering around in all these Arab countries, speaking Hebrew and the like. So afterwards she comes up to check if I'm really a spy. And then I share with her a story that, and this is a really very moving story, that when I was in Damascus, and as I said, Begin had recently now been elected prime minister, the Syrian Jews drank a l'chaim at Menachem Begin's election. And the reason they did so, it still moves me now, the reason they did so is they said, we believe that with Menachem Begin, Tavo Agula, our redemption will come with him becoming a prime minister. And as a result of, my wife, I then met with, after I told her the story, she then said, oh, you have to meet with Menachem Begin, you have to tell him what you just told me. I said, what was true, I didn't know Menachem Begin. Through her, I came to know Menachem Begin, shared with him, Sadat's message, and he asked me what I thought of. He said, and did Sadat add anything? I said, well, Sadat said he's prepared to make peace, one, if Israel withdraws from the whole of the Sinai, and two, if it recognizes the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. And Begin said at that time, impossible, that can't happen. But we know at the end of the day, in fact, Israel withdrew from Sinai, and part of the Camp David agreement had a clause recognition of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Now, I say this, and I have to say, because I think, Begin was a leader of courage and conviction and the like. And when I saw Abbas 2 years ago, and I told him this story as part of saying to him, he has to meet directly with Netanyahu. I said, there would not have been an Egyptian-Israeli peace if the international community had been involved, the Americans. I said, Begin and Sadat met over and over again and worked it out. There's an incredible exchange at one point where Sadat, in talking about the West Bank, refers to Judea and Yehuda and Shomron. Sadat picked up Begin's language in the course of the discourse between them. Okay. Now, so I said, you have to speak directly with Netanyahu. So then he said to me, then let me ask you the same two questions that Sadat asked. Can I make peace with the Likud? I said, same answer. They will. Can I? He says, now, Netanyahu, you know. Begin, you said you didn't know. Can I make peace with Netanyahu? I said, yes. I believe also that Netanyahu would like to make peace with the Palestinian people. But it will not happen if you go to the UN It will not happen if you will try to go to the International Criminal Court. It will not happen if you only try to work through US pressure on Israel. You have to speak directly to Israel, and you have to stop the state-sanctioned incitement for two reasons. One, because you're pushing away people in Israel who might otherwise support you, because they believe you're not genuinely interested in peace if you're engaged in this kind of state-sanctioned incitement. And the second thing is, you've got to stop it for the sake of your own people. I said, you know, I've always supported what's today called a two-state solution, going way back. I said when it was not politically correct to do so. But I didn't only support an independent Palestinian state. I said I supported an independent, democratic, rights-protecting, rule of law Palestinian state. That will be the best guarantee for peace with Israel, and that will be the best guarantee for authentic self-determination for the Palestinian people. So to close on this, one, it would have to be direct negotiations between Abbas and Netanyahu, and unlike with Sadat, here there's a Hamas, that there was no Hamas with regard.